Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome or welcome back, as the case might be. My name is Dalibor Petrovic. I am the founder of the Summit Leadership Alliance and the host of these TechTonic Conversations, a channel where I'm bringing and welcoming guests who have interesting, cool stories to tell, whether it's about their tech leadership experiences or emerging technology trends or great Canadian tech startups and scale-up companies. Today, I am thrilled to welcome my friend and my colleague, Brennan Schmidt. Brennan, thank you very much for your time and welcome to this episode.
Thank you so much for having me, Dalibor. Great to be connecting with you again.
It's lovely to see you, Brennan. So, Brennan Schmidt is the founder and CEO of Alias Consulting Group, and Alias Consulting Group specializes in tabletop exercises. This is a very interesting topic. I am personally curious to learn more. Of course, conceptually, of course, I know what those are, but I'm really interested to learn how would one actually approach organizing and delivering an actual tabletop exercise. So that's what we'll be covering today. This is superbly relevant and timely, especially when you apply these exercises on topics of cyber threats and elevate them to the boards and executives where this actually has the maximum impact. And nevertheless, I'm not going to be stealing any thunder, Brennan, from you, but I wanted to just let the audience know what this conversation today is going to be about. We are doing this live on this fine Wednesday, April 30th, 2025. The session will be recorded and available on YouTube. If you enjoy this kind of programming, please please subscribe to the channel so you'll be notified next time I put content up. And now, Brennan, instead of me doing not doing you justice of proper introduction, I'd like to actually ask you to introduce yourself to us, who you are, how you navigated your life, what led you to now start, Alias Consulting.
Great. Well, once again, thank you so much for the warm welcome and introduction here, Dalibor. Really excited to be on the show here today and take a deep dive, like you mentioned, about tabletops. My story, funny enough, if you wonder about how someone who has their undergraduate in as a secondary high school business teacher, that's what I was originally going to be. So
Oh,
if
yeah?
you think back to the time when my undergrad, I thought I was going to be a high school teacher. So in terms of that, life presented different things for me. So ended up going from my internship and had a really strong desire to go into the classroom and teach high school. I still keep plugged in with teaching with the University of Regina with the Hill JDC West business competition team. I've been helping out over the course of about a decade now there. But that's really the whole classroom hands-on experience. But in terms of work, and actually where we got connected is I did a little bit of a stint with the government of Saskatchewan, so got really immersed in the public sector and mostly in communications and public relations. So that was my focus was on PR. So a lot of crisis communications, crisis management. That could be its own show, but in keeping with what we're talking about here today,
Yeah.
uh, you gotta love the shameless plug there for another topic. But as far as what ended up crossing paths and like you'd shared in LinkedIn with this conversation, I ended up crossing paths not only with you but also with quite a few colleagues over in my Deloitte days. So I was a senior consultant over at Deloitte, working across a multitude of different sectors, as we know in professional services. That gets you a lot of different access. So whether or not it's health and life sciences, moving on to anything related to energy and resources, et cetera, just really broaden my perspective and experience in terms of what specifically those sectors need, and also had the opportunity to work on a couple of cybersecurity engagements. And then fast forward to today, having conversations like this and even just doing executive briefings and the like, this topic of not only cybersecurity itself, but also empowering leaders to feel better about what this stuff is, knowing that there's stuff coming from all over the place. That's really, I think, what we're here to talk about today. And I'm really excited for the conversation.
Absolutely, and I very much look forward to this. Um, I know from the work that I do that one of the most important and most uncomfortable discussions with board members and senior executives are the topics of technology and are the topics of cyber specifically because it's so threatening and it's so unknown and uncomfortable. So anything that I think that we as technologists can do to unveil the mystery to those who will govern and decide is a big plus. And if we can help them at least understand what questions to ask and which answers not to accept, we will be miles ahead. So I think that we are on the same page. We are embarking on this edutainment path to educate, inform, right, and help. So Brennan, over to you. Let's take a deeper dive into this.
Absolutely. I'll share my screen here and hopefully things show up the right
I'll
way.
show
I'll
you a finger
just
up, a thumb up if it goes well. Ooh, that is not the screen you want to see. It looks good, by the way. It's on.
it is not the screen you want to see. And so just we're not going to be talking about ransomware today. We want to be more forward looking and think beyond ransomware. Ransomware is still going to have a place, and it is certainly an area of concern for organizations, no matter the sector. But like you said, Delabor, we don't really want to see screens like this. And if we were to talk about how we use screens like this in order to shape a conversation, let's dive in. So this screen looks unappealing for a few different reasons. Number one, it's a red screen, and if that was the case, obviously it's a fictional screen. It would look different depending on the threat actor. But if you break it down into its components, there's some things that can be very, very rich in conversation if you take a deeper dive into it. For example, you see that there's Bitcoin mentioned here. We know that the price of Bitcoin fluctuates. Bitcoin, is that something that the company needs to manage? Is that something that now, if all of a sudden there is a breach, that is a managed service provider or breach coach or that other person who's helping you out with that? All of this stuff we're really cruising through, but also I think that the most important part of this as well is you see the time constraint. So where I think that this bubbles up and becomes really meaningful, especially for senior leaders, is that absent of the fact that there are some technical nuances in the screen of what you see, two of which I covered before, really when it comes down to strategically being able to respond to this and having it so that you have different folks come to the table being prepared to be able to action on what happens if all of a sudden we have to pay a whole bunch of money, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of dollars within a short time period. How do we as a senior leadership team and executive make that happen? And then also too, if that gets escalated to a board and that needs to be a board decision, how do we get those two very different uh, views and perspectives represented at the table? So that's really what we're all about here and what we're going to dive into today, Dalibor.
Let's do it.
So, so before diving into things, and this is a bit of a crash course, if you will, let's talk a little bit about what cybersecurity is. And so you'll see the definition here. I won't read it out, but if we look at a couple key words that stand out, which are the art. It
Mm-hmm.
really is an art with cybersecurity because we have that human element. We
Yeah.
always have that human element. For example, it's very appealing, it seems, to have, box of donuts and you have your hands full, and somebody always seems to be compelled to keep that door open for you. You might not even work at the company, but then now all of a sudden you're tailgating and you get in. That's preying on human behavior. So if we start thinking about the art of being able to make it so that people, process, technology all can work together, that's moving us in the right direction. But then all of a sudden we have all these other things. Because if we start looking at information technology, that's something that is certainly topical and that folks care about. So we know that there's servers, there's virtual machines, there's all that stuff to manage endpoints and devices that folks use on a day-to-day basis. But then there's the stuff behind the curtains, which is operational technology. And if we think about operational technology for a second, that's the stuff that is usually in the background, but is hugely important no matter what the sector is. But specifically, if you deal with valves, if you deal with pipes, if you deal with conveyor belts, temperature sensing, centrifuges, anything like that, that's a very, very important piece of technology
Yeah.
that you don't want to have go awry.
I would even say that, when you talk about information technology, your threat is mostly financial. But if you talk about operational technology, the threat actually can be to life and limb, right? So and I think that underpinning point that you are bringing here is that in these days and even more tomorrow, everything is going to be smart, semi-intelligent, and connected, right? From the machine that digs, all the way, of course, to your AI agent and humanoid robot, friend, colleague, whatever, right?
Exactly. Well, and we talk about agents and exactly that point, Dalibor, and that's also something to point out as well. We have Internet of Things, we've got AI, we've got all these agents acting independently, more and more permissions having to be managed, and seeing what that looks like. We're at a very interesting state of affairs, and that's really where the value of tabletops is that you can bring folks together and have these kinds of structured conversations that we'll delve into in a few moments, and just really start opening up the onion, if you will, and peeling back what potential gaps might be there.
Hmm. Hmm.
So that's really all there is in terms of the definition. So many may be asking, okay, so we set the context for what the value is of a tabletop exercise. But if we start thinking about what a tabletop exercise actually is, really, like I had pointed to, it's a way of being able to get different players at the table and really pressure test a lot of the assumptions that we have. Because in a lot of cases, I'm sure you've found even with clients too that you've worked with, that there's this idea in our minds that things will work out a specific way until reality happens and proves otherwise.
Yep.
So coming back to that red screen for an example, we talked about 72 hours and we may go, okay, well, backups might be something that could be arranged or maybe they were unaffected, maybe they weren't. But then now if all of a sudden that goes from 72 hours to 24 hours, how does that impact decision making?
Hmm.
And what methods are in place to help support that? So that actually is a really good hint in terms of what an inject is. And what an inject is in terms of a tabletop exercise is we'll go through a narrative, and today we'll actually use a sample inject just to give you a bit of a flavor as to what that would look like. But ultimately, an inject is meant to really pressure test a lot of those assumptions. So, say, for example, if this is with a board, and now a board is having to interact with an executive, what level of visibility should the board have in the context of things? Let's say if all of a sudden word gets out, should that be the public relations team that looks after that, or should that be something that the board wants to stay plugged in on? If we're sticking to governance and the role of the board in terms of strategy, it should probably be kept at the strategic level with letting operations do the great job that they do. So that really is a way of being able to pressure test whatever audience you're looking for.
Yeah.
There's a really big but in here, though, Dalibor, in terms of an exception. In order to do that, it's so important to make sure that we are empowering folks, because I think that that's really something that I love about tabletops is, well, it is very serious business, like very serious business, as you pointed out, especially if OT is affected, operational technology. If that's affected, that could be a life or death
Oh, yeah.
scenario. That is very serious business. You don't want to mess with that or make light or not like deal with that incorrectly. At the same time, if you think about making it so that people feel as though this is serious business, but I had fun learning, that's something that tabletops do. But the only way of being able to do that is by making sure that you're fostering that culture. So I shared here a few examples in terms of setting the stage so that if folks want to start getting a little bit of a feel as to what a tabletop exercise could entail, it's just so important to make sure that that hidden agenda isn't there or that people feel as though they're being put on the spot or pressured.
Yeah.
So if that is set for the stage, it then paves the way for what we're going to do here as part of the rest of our conversation is to actually walk through what a potential framework might look like. Now, what you see here on the screen is a framework, and I'll underscore that because there are a multitude of frameworks out there. This one specifically I use, and you'll notice that govern is at the end, and the reason why govern is at the end of this process is because, in terms of making things even more tangible and answering the question, well, what do we do with this? That's really where govern is such a fundamental component of it. And
Yeah.
in fact, governance is part of the NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, their second version of the cybersecurity framework, or CSF. If you hear the terms NIST, CSF tossed around at meetings, especially from cyber teams, that's what that's in reference to. Governance, in terms of the version 2, was a huge component of that.
Mhm.
So I know we've covered a lot, and I don't know if there are any questions that are coming in so far here, Delabor, or if you have anything that you want to add.
So far, this is very good and very logical, and I'm following, of course. If audience has any questions, please use Q&A function of the Zoom platform and submit them. I'll be paying attention to them. So let's proceed, Brennan. And if there are questions, I'll be jumping in and asking them on behalf of our audience.
Excellent. And yeah, we want to make sure that this is interactive too. So even though Dalibor and I are going to be interacting here with some Q's and A's, and I'll be asking Dalibor some questions, and that's how we'll go through the conversation here today. And we will follow that progression that you see here on the
Yep.
screen. So I'll take a little bit of a deeper dive into each one of these steps.
Yep.
But yeah, if there's anything that comes up, by all means, feel free to ask, and that's just what makes this that much more dynamic.
I will say though that I think that govern it, I almost want to say it's govern, but also it's govern in action. It's govern as in let's revisit if we need to how we govern based on what just happened in the exercise, and then whatever we've identified as potential gaps, we gotta now action them, right? So to me, govern and action is what that final step really is, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I've got a slide a little bit later on, but I think that's a really great way of being able to talk about what we'll get to at the end of this,
Mm.
which is the after action report. So there is a deliverable usually as part of a tabletop exercise, and that's really where we start articulating exactly what some of those challenges were. But then exactly to your point, what do we do? And more specifically, who do we task with taking hold of these things, and when do we want to get those things done by? Because the last thing we want to do is just have a huge list of an inventory of all these things that need to be done.
Mhm.
But then the question becomes who looks after it and when?
Yeah.
And especially if there are board priorities, you want to make sure that those are also adhered to as well, if that is in fact the audience.
Yeah, very good, very good, very good. We do have some questions coming in. The slide deck, I'm assuming you'll be able to share the slide deck afterwards with people who might be
Absolutely.
interested. So Vaj calling Bandai, if you will get the deck afterwards, I'll make sure that it's available. Um, the question coming from Michael is when you're doing the tabletop exercises, are you doing this electronically or is it done manually, paper-based? It's more of a logistical question. And maybe what you can do is you can, before we delve into the actual storyline of an exercise, just give us a coordination around like this is who is this aimed for? How long does it take typically to prepare for an exercise? Who are the typical stakeholders in the room? How long will a typical tabletop exercise last? Some of these sort of logistical orientations for people who might be curious, who sort of heard about this but haven't done it themselves.
Help equip Dalibor that it depends. I
Well,
wanted to add that
it's
to
a
the bingo
typical and
sheet.
correct. It's a typical and a correct consulting answer, by the way. Yes, I agree.
That's right. So we added that to the bingo sheet there. But in all seriousness, fantastic question. So let's work back. So, in terms of getting something like a tabletop exercise, it all depends on the audience. So, that's really going to determine what level of granularity and how much additional planning is required. That's the simple, succinct answer.
Mhm.
So, let's say if this is something for an executive leadership audience, you could probably get something within 8 weeks and plan that, assuming that you've reviewed the documents that you either have to share as a pre-read for the folks participating so that they feel equipped, and instead of just showing up at the table and being like, I don't know what to do with this. This is the first time we're talking about it. Because again, back to that point of empowerment, it's so important to make sure that people feel plugged in while at the same time finding that balance so that you're not giving away all the answers, because that defeats the purpose of the pressure testing. So suppose you've got that amount of time in order to have, let's say, an 8 week time period, as an example, to have something pulled together. Then what you would do is make sure that you've got at least 3.5 hours in place to do the tabletop exercise. And that really is a minimum, because anything less than that is going to be really difficult to actually go down some of the rabbit holes that may need to be ventured, if I can put it that way.
Yep.
And so that's why just generally it depends on your audience and your availability. But suppose now you want to have the board and you want to have executives come together at the same table. That may demand additional time as well as some sequencing, because as we know, board members are going to have day jobs as well, and they will have presumably certain cadence that they will meet.
Yep.
But appreciate the question.
Awesome. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Let's carry on bravely.
Excellent. Well, I think that's a really great segue from the last point that I should also mention as well, is that in terms of the structure, you'll notice that today's structure actually follows the tabletop exercise structure that I have as well, which is a sort of a three-act play, if you think of it that way. So Act One is context setting. It really is just going through and mapping out exactly what it is that we're going to be talking about. It can include figures, it can include maybe some videos, maybe some interviews, that kind of stuff, just to make sure that folks really lean in and see how real this is. And then if you progress on to Act Two, if you will, which is what we're doing right now, that's where we start going through this progression that we'll cover here. And I'll
Mhm.
set the stage here for that in a moment. And then last but not least, which we'll do almost uh, poetically, we'll be doing a little bit of an after action report here in terms of a debrief at the conclusion of our session here today, which will bring us to a close with this conversation.
Good.
So, so this I want to set the stage for things. And Dalibor, I know you've been talking quite a bit about deepfake videos, and we heard of this one case that was published here not too long ago about how there was a deepfake video that was so compelling that all of a sudden a whole bunch of money ended up making its way into the wrong hands.
Yep. Yep.
It's scary. Like if you heard of that, Dalibor, what comes to mind in terms of what your reaction would be?
It's going to be increasingly difficult to actually be certain who are you talking to on screen. This is, I think, a completely new and unusual vector of attack that most people are going to have. Well, actually, nobody's going to be able to recognize, but most people won't even think about it to look for validation. So I think this is superbly important, very, very dangerous. Uh, yeah. And I also know, actually, I had a guest from New York, a company that's actually working to solve for deep fake recognition. Therefore, like this is very real, it's very present, it's happening now.
And I really appreciate you sharing that, Dalibor. And also when we connected before this call and we were talking a little bit ahead of time in terms of what future thinking looks like, this is a really great way of being able to say, okay, so if ransomware is still important, like we talked about at the beginning of the show here, I'm not trying to decrease or diminish the value of that conversation, because it's still it affects pretty much every single sector, and it's very topical. But at the same time, I think like what you had mentioned in terms of, well, what's on the horizon? And instead of experiencing this and being in the newspaper headline, or if you're in any sort of other headline, how do we get ahead of that in a safe environment?
Mhm.
Because that's one thing I think that I'll mention here before diving in, is that a tabletop exercise is a great way of being able to bring together folks representing different areas outside of IT or OT. And the reason why I say that is because, as an example, do we know who our legal counsel is? And do we know who would need to be in the room for that? And then the other nuanced question is, okay, well, if we have in-house counsel, that's great. But then now, what are the potential gotchas in terms of legal privilege where now, let's say we have to get a third party counsel in place to make sure that there's a clear line of separation so that anything that is under legal privilege falls under that category. Now, I won't get into the legal specifics about it. I just happen to interact with those folks as part of these discussions. I'm not a lawyer myself, but in terms of general advice to maybe start thinking about is exactly what needs to be true to make sure that all of the bases are covered with the tabletop. So that's legal. Now, if we shift gears and start talking about what that looks like in the context of communications and public relations, huge implications with that as well. Because suppose as we dive through here in terms of each progression, what happens if all of a sudden now you're on social media and the news gets out that this happened?
Mhm.
What are you going to do with that?
Yep.
And lastly is IT. IT certainly plays a role in all of this, but then also too, let's remember, it isn't necessarily the IT shop in-house that we have to also work with. We know that in a lot of cases, there's managed service providers, there's also third parties that come in that really make every single gear within the organization turn. We want to make sure that we're not missing any. So that really is where we're going to explore that and see where those folks come into play here as we go through the tabletop. So I'd encourage folks here as we dive right in order to start thinking about that. Maybe just a quick check. Any questions so far, or do we
All
want
good.
to dive right in? All
Let's
good?
go.
Okay. So this here, courtesy of ChatGPT image generation, really simple prompt, make something relatively photorealistic. And this is the first step where all of a sudden, as you can see on the slide here, a video comes in claiming to be somebody of authority here, urgently asking for a specific amount of money, and it's under NDA, non-disclosure agreement. So as we can see here, and as we're looking at this, we really get the sense of the urgency in all of this.
Mhm.
And what it is it's really predicated on two things. So when we think about when we talk about cybersecurity events, and especially with these kinds of things, it's either going to be fear or it's going to be delight. So in this case, fear is something that definitely is there. You don't want to say no to the boss. You don't want to make the boss unhappy. So of course you're going to comply with that. No questions asked, potentially. So one question is what is done about that? So we'll go through a few different questions, and I'll ask Dalibor here some questions here just to get us started. But want to encourage other folks to dive into the conversation as well, based off of the preceded questions that we have, keeping in mind that there's also the other side of the equation, that if we weren't doing necessarily something where it was uh, specific demand out of fear, there's also another example that we could do. Let's say if we were to do this all over again, where there's delight. You just got a promotion. You just got winnings from a lottery, or you got that coveted parking spot, whatever it might be. That's a pretext to getting people to let their guard down. And that's really where things come into play for tabletop exercises. So I guess the first question I'll ask you, Dalibor, is how aware do you think staff and executives are of deepfakes in this context here, just
Uh,
based off of what we've covered?
I would say that majority of people probably have heard about deepfakes, and majority of people do not appreciate how sophisticated this technology already is. I think there is also a sense that people probably have, which is I think a wrong sense that it is not gonna fool me. It ain't gonna fool me because I've been around for 53 years. I can sense and recognize a human, right? So I think that this vector is very open and very problematic. And I think that every organization needs to have a concerted effort educating everybody about what this is, what this could look like. I love that you are identifying two potential themes of attack. One of fear and urgency, the other one of delight. I think that's actually very clever and true. Now that you said it, I didn't think about it before, but I think it's actually very real, very problematic, and that people are not generally not ready for it, not ready to protect from it, let's say.
And I think those are some great points, and I'll just maybe pull on a couple threads in what you just mentioned there, Dalibor, because really, in terms of really making this crystallize with the organization and asking the question, so what? Because I can imagine there's some folks that are saying, okay, well, I get the value of it. I have colleagues, we do this all the time at operations. Maybe we do it with the board, maybe we do it like there's a lot on my plate. Why prioritize this? Really, the objective would be to identify what those crown jewels are in the organization. And by that, I mean the crown jewels. If you were to imagine putting every single thing of importance in an inventory, and if one of those things ends up going down or is taken over or what have you, how disruptive is that at crushing the business? And if you can map your tabletop exercises not only to your crown jewels that you have, but also your enterprise risk, if you can have that cohesion between those things, I think that that's really where you start getting folks to lean in because now this becomes less of an exercise in IT. And now this is more of a, well, hang on a second. I know my cyber team's doing this, but hang on a second. Where is risk in all of this? Where is legal?
Yeah.
Because are they chatting with each other, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And by the way, for people who might be interested to learn, where are things at right now with these AI avatars, which can be used to, manufacture these attacks? There's a phenomenal clip that Peter Diamandis posted on YouTube a couple of weeks ago from his conference in San Francisco called The Abundance, where he interviewed Joshua Q, who is the CEO of HeyGen, and a company that is at the moment, I think, in the leading position, creating these artificial intelligence avatars that actually look, feel, and engage in conversations with you um, in a completely natural way. So not only do you get a video recorded message, which would have been previously the way to do this, you could actually next be facing, your actual CFO having an actual conversation with you in real time, instructing you. Like, so that's how far we are at the moment, right? I just want to make sure that, because I actually I saw this literally 10 days ago. I was floored.
Maybe just as a check here, I'm touching my ears and you can see there's a side profile. So I'm not a deep fake. Are you deep fake, Delabor? You
Sorry, am I
I
a deep?
think you're
I will let
you're
everybody know. I will let everybody know at the end when my
okay.
other self walks into this room.
Okay. Okay. But the fact that we're even having to ask these questions is just it it's mind-blowing, really. But I think that it just really crystallizes that, and I think that's an excellent example that you shared because I think that that lends itself to the next phase here. So now we're going into cartoon caricatures and just how easy it is to produce these things. It's a prompt of a situation put into an image. How much easier can it get? This, what you're seeing, by the way, is a presentation. Just imagine how much easier it's become for threat actors to have even more sophisticated emails, let's say for anything targeting that area, and then voice, and now video, and the
Yeah.
list goes on and on and on. So in this case, now we're going to do a little bit of analysis here, and it turns out that that shouldn't have happened. And now the individual who was supposed to be giving that order or that ability to pay, turns out that
Wasn't
wasn't
them.
real.
Yeah.
It wasn't them. It was completely fake. So they had no knowledge of the transaction or of the vendor. So I guess one question that comes to mind here, just in looking here, is how were they able to bypass normal communication protocols, you think?
Uh, I don't know, but probably. Well, obviously this is a phishing, right? So when you say how did they, do you mean technically how? I think this is more like playing on people's emotions, right? It's playing on people's desire to serve, desire to please, desire to be quick, desire to be noticed, right? It's a social engineering exercise most of the time, isn't it?
Exactly. Yes. And I love that you concentrated on the human factor, like what we talked about there before, Dalibor, because I think that warrants underscoring in all of this. Because from a technical controls perspective, there's a lot of ways of being able to get into the weeds of exactly how this might have happened. It might have originated from an email. Maybe it was something where now there was an email exchange that took place, and now there's a lot more of a relationship that's established. Because by the way, in terms of threat actors, really what they want to do is ideally they don't want to be known. They want to do all the research on your organization. They want to scroll through LinkedIn posts. And by the way, now we have autonomous agents that can do all of that stuff.
Yeah.
So something that took people a lot of time is now automated. And now you do enough surveillance and reconnaissance of an organization, that you now know what their fonts are, what the colors are that they use for their marketing. You have all this research in place, and let's say you start communicating with them. That's now something where it becomes a part of that conversation. And so the other question that comes to mind here is at what point, just no right or wrong answer, but at what point do we think that those controls that we thought we had in place broke down here?
Hmm. That's actually it's a good question. It's a valid question. Um, so that actually could be a very that could actually be both human but also technical gap. There could be a technical vulnerability, for example. So what is masquerading as an email coming from a company with some, unveiling a couple of levels below should be evident that email domain perhaps is not, that domain that is not it's not right domain, it's not the right network, and so on and so forth. So there could be a combination of technical gaps, the actual vulnerabilities that exist in the system that have not been patched or closed, combined with, the human factor, right?
Exactly. And we keep coming back to that human factor. And I love that you mentioned that, Dalibor, because another thing to maybe mention as well is that if this is a sort of a dry run of a tabletop and this is a conversation between us and those joining us for the webinar, that allows us to get a little bit more meta in this case, because we did certainly have the issue with IT and technology. But also, let's be reminded that this is also something related to finance.
Mm.
And so when we're planning this as well, where do we bring in finance into this discussion? Because there's presumably, and I'm not a finance person, I've worked with them in the past, as most of us have, but at the same time, from a controls perspective, they have their own methodology, an internal audit, list goes on and on. Those folks would be a great audience to get plugged in either during the tabletop or back to the original question at the beginning here of our webinar is, well, how do you go about planning this and making it really effective? Legal, HR, uh, public relations, having anyone related to finance, especially if
Yep.
it's something related to this, fantastic way of being able to explore that question. So what control took place that all of a sudden now somebody was able to transact that amount of money? I thought we would have had like two-person control with this, right?
Yeah,
Which is
exactly.
similar to IT and finance
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, so
or
so
accounting.
far we are setting the stage. This is we are in the boardroom. All the stakeholders are at the table. The stage has been set. This is the moment. This is what happened, right? So now we are moving into the actual exercise. What happens next, right?
Exactly, yes. And so we're going through the progression, and so we've animated things, or not animated, but we have the image here where we're setting the context. This is very much a condensed version of a tabletop.
Yep.
But ideally, you would go through and you would actually list each one of the different questions in order of importance, and it all comes back down to that planning. So let's say if you've got 5 or 7 questions that you want to walk through as part of these different stages, that is clearly going to take X amount of time. And so back to the question in terms of how much time you want to budget for the tabletop, it really is that discussion and seeing which questions matter at the table.
So what you're actually effectively saying is that in the actual exercise, during the tabletop exercise, at this point, we are not yet into remediation. We are now at the point of realizing, oh shoot, right? At this point, you are actually engaging the client at the tabletop exercise in the actual questions and exploring how might this have happened? Why did this happen? Where were the failures in our system? Like, is this a so what you're saying is that this is not just setting the stage. This is setting the stage, but also taking the time to explore the rationale of why are we in this situation, even before we enter into the next phase, which will be talking about what do we do about this next, right?
Exactly,
So this
exactly.
is a moment of reflection, moment of discussion, and an opportunity to identify already now what could be our gaps in our, controls, security, and behaviors, norms, and so on, and so on, and so on. Right? So good, very good. I got it.
Exactly.
Actually,
Exactly.
got it.
And I think you underscored that point perfectly, Dalibor, is that when you start thinking about doing this as part of a tabletop, the other piece is keeping notes of all that because the discussion is fantastic and it should be a fruitful conversation for those who are participating. At the same time, make sure that you have some folks who can also take some notes of the action items. I know it sounds simple, but oftentimes we get so immersed in the conversation that sometimes we go, "Oh, yeah, that's actually a huge gap that we should look at including in the report." So just a little bit of a tip there in terms of that. But wait, hang on a second here. There's an inject now
Hmm.
where all of a sudden now we're talking LinkedIn and this has spread. So it's not isolated now, Dalibor, to just one person. What do we do?
Okay, look at that. This is the twist. This is the twist you mentioned. S- Like it's not gonna be as easy and simple as just flowing your interest. Okay, so here's a twist, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So what do we do? And so the payroll audit, again, it's that pretext. It's framing people's minds in such a way so that you get that outcome. And so if we think about the injects as an example, this one's just a sample. But if you really start looking at pressure testing where your organization might come to a standstill, let's say, that's really a good way of being able to do that because so far until this point, we talked about, well, this is, we think, just an isolated incident. But now if all of a sudden we just throw a new piece of information or that plot twist, if you will, that really is something that can shake things up and have folks really lean in and say, well, hang on a second, we didn't really think of that. And maybe one last point on that, and why I think it's just so beneficial to do this when it's in times of non-crisis, if I can put it that way,
Yeah.
is because you can actually have that presence of mind and you can start thinking about that. And it's not so time sensitive and pressured that now you and I are sort of bantering about things and we're saying, well, you didn't do your job. Not that we would say that, hopefully, but if it was an actual crisis, our minds aren't usually programmed to react that way. So what better way than to actually go through that exercise before something was to happen so that it becomes a more engaging dialogue amongst leaders. So really it is the leadership imperative here.
That's very much so. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
absolutely.
So let's say we cruise through that and now we get to the remediation phase. So let's say we cruise past the inject, we have a really fulsome discussion about what that looks like. How do we go about remediating the issue? And you can see here as some examples, maybe the financial institution is alerted to something. Maybe we end up having internal incident response as part of this as well. And the list goes on and on. So one question is, what is the role of executive leadership in all of this? So if we
Yeah.
were to bubble this up to the highest level here, and if this is strictly operational, what role do we think executive leadership plays at this stage in the game?
Well, they clearly are determining what kind of which direction are we going in general, I guess. Is this something that we are going to, uh, you know, are we going to be paying the ransom? Are we going to not be paying the ransom? If we do, what are the potential outcomes of each of those directions, right? Weighing the pros and cons, I guess, and setting the direction. I'm assuming by but also being advised by a group of experts along the way, from legal to cyber and others who have to be involved in the process. But I think like it's obvious, like the executive leadership's presence, involvement, and direction is paramount here, right? It could be the difference between success and calamity at the end of the day, right?
Exactly, exactly. And in the case of the deepfake video, there's a lot of other considerations with that too, right? What kind of level of detail needs to be put in place as part of that, and how do we how do we
Yeah.
s- shore up some of the gaps, at least in the near term, so that we can start progressing here? And that might be a good segue into the next piece, where now we're actually in, let's say, the recovery stage, where now we're looking through how best to return to normal operations. Because again, if we were to go in the way back machine here, we know that the financial transaction took place, and this might actually be a really good stopping point here, just to do a little bit of a recap. Is we started off knowing that there was this deep fake video. And all of a sudden, this financial transaction happened. Then all of a sudden, it was found out that that wasn't the case and it shouldn't have happened. And then all of a sudden, there's the plot twist, and we find out that now LinkedIn is being cruised through, and this is likely to spread across the organization. What do we do about this? This is now that juncture in the process where we can actually start thinking about, well, okay, assuming that we've shored up all of those gaps as best we can at this moment, how do we actually go about restoring normal operations with things? What kind of things can we have in place?
Yeah, 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 yeah. And I think that it's obvious to me the first time that this exercise is done at the board and executive level, at this point, probably board members are going to be asking, ladies and gentlemen, do we have plans in place? Do we know at which point do we actually pay for this and keep it quiet? At which point do we not? Have we played these different scenarios already? And the answer, of course, for the first time is going to be no. So probably in this point, I would assume at this point, somebody in the room is going to say, look, I expect to have, 5 scenarios written down so that we are ready, not if, but when something like this happens, we know which chapter of the book we go to. Is that fair?
Exactly. That's exactly it. And that's what I love about how if you have that crossover of all these different disciplines, because what I find so fascinating about tabletops and why I just love doing them is because I'm just a facilitator at the end of the day. And I just happen to know a little bit of language from the different areas that are represented to keep the dialogue going. I think that that's it's a bit of a superpower, if you will, in terms of that. But what I love is to be able to position, let's say at a board level tabletop, position operations in a way where they are able to engage with, let's say, the board and say, yes, we've got that in hand. If this were to happen, this is how we would presumably present it to you. And then here's what you would maybe need to decide upon.
Yeah.
And just having that relationship in place beforehand, I think ultimately not only builds trust, because I think that that's the important part there, but also too, I think it just makes folks that are doing amazing work to be able to have their work showcased,
Yeah.
which in a lot of cases, yes, we are putting things under the microscope, if you will. But again, and I can't reinforce this enough, if
Yeah.
we have this culture in place where it's okay as part of a tabletop to make mistakes, and we are going to pressure test things, but that is not a reflection of you and the great work that you're doing or your team. It's just a way of bringing this together so that we're not all of a sudden just saying, screaming in a room. That's ultimately the objective of what we want.
And so Kevin here put a comment in the question, with which I agree 100%. That says it's important to reinforce that top executives cannot bypass financial controls. What I think is really important is the exercise like this actually can surface issues that exist across the whole enterprise, which is not necessarily, which is not at all contained to a cyber team. When we think cybersecurity, obviously the mind goes to, oh, well, do we have the strong cyber team putting technological protection in place? Yes, but everybody else here has a role to play. Everybody else here can literally screw things up. So that's the value of bringing everybody together in the room and discussing and playing through scenarios like this. So thank you, Kevin. You're 100% right. All right,
Thank you, Kevin.
moving on.
Yes, yes. So just doing a quick time check here. So what do we do going forward? So in terms of governing things, how do we stay informed of emerging threats? Might be a question, right? So if we talked a little bit about the controls and let's say we have a recommendation where we engage a little bit more with accounting to make sure that there is that second order of oversight, if you will. That's certainly one question to explore. But in terms of governing this, we know based off of the discussion so far that this isn't a problem that's going away. And if anything, to your point earlier, Dalibor, is that there's an increasing level of sophistication that's coming into play here.
Yeah.
And so, from a governance perspective, what are we going to do about it? Because let's be very clear, these issues are not going away. I'm sorry to say, and I think that we've talked about this, but I think it bears repeating. These issues aren't going to go away, and there's only so much that technology can do.
Yeah.
Humans are always going to play a part in that because we know from social engineering that there's some pieces that can be exploited. And also, too, maybe something else, if we're talking about a operational level tabletop exercise, what better way than to get all the different areas of representation of the cybersecurity team to be involved in a tabletop so that, let's say, those that are defending things are able to speak about the things that they're doing on a daily basis to help keep some of these things at bay. And then what does that look like from somebody who's a threat actor and those who are channeling the threat actor to try to battle it out? So it's a very interesting way of being able to have those conversations come out and do that.
And what you can do at this point is you can also say, okay, so this now gives us a peek into how we might need to govern maybe differently. But if we have finance at the table, IT at the table, HR at the table, legal at the table, public relations at the table, operations at the table, cyber team at the table, following this exercise, imagine the power of saying to all of these leaders, bring me back three things, three improvements you will institute in your domain based on what we've just lived through, right? To me, that is this opportunity here, the way to not just experience what scenario could feel like in like what could this really feel like, but how do we convert this into more proactive action that is that is zoomed that because of course people don't like we all struggle with time and resources. How do you figure out of potential 100 things you can do, what are the top three things that will make the biggest difference? And this to me lends itself perfectly for that cross enterprise opportunity to come together and improve or come together and protect, right?
That is so well put, Dalibor. And even as you're going through that, I'm envisioning, let's say if HR is at the table, let's say they've got a learning management system, and if they're
Yeah,
looking for future looking content, what better way to maybe make a work plan for coming up with deep fake training? And now, from
bingo.
a compliance
Exactly.
perspective, you roll that out. So again, it's less of a you shall do this and more of that collaboration, which I think is where it's just so empowering from a leadership perspective. And you're facilitating that conversation through a tabletop. It's lower pressure for all of this. And it gets folks thinking about the what if. We think about the art of the possible.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
okay, so I have a couple of questions for you. So obviously this is very different from doing penetration testing and other sort of more traditional cybersecurity activities that are typically done by cybersecurity teams. Can you provide me some perspective on how often should an organization have this board executive level tabletop exercise? What is that like a good practice around this?
Can I use up bingo card number two for it depends?
Mhm.
I think it should at least be done once because I think it's a great question, Dalibor. I think in a lot of cases when we start thinking about the frequency, just do one if you haven't done it. That is a step in the right direction.
Yeah.
And then once you get the buy-in and you have folks really leaning into this, then increase the cadence, maybe even broaden the audience too. Because if we think of it from the perspective of the board over here, maybe that's an annual something that's reported upon. And then now if you're talking about operations, maybe that's monthly, quarterly, whatever that cadence is. But I think the key message there to answer your question, Dalibor, is just get started.
Yeah.
Just do one and just learn from the failures because there will be them.
This is this could be also viewed as a trigger event that causes an organization to institute a program of cyber protection that will involve, an annual board executive tabletop exercise that drives, as you said, quarterly pen testing system, and then maybe once a year there is a blind, internal attack on everybody with phishing attack on everybody that validates how many people are going to fall for it. Like this could be part of a very a programmatic view, I guess, to protecting the enterprise that just rolls on, baby.
100%. 100%, because let's pull on that thread for a second in terms of the phishing. Let's assume that if we were to do a tabletop exercise, let's assume that we did all of that training, we constantly test this, but in the tabletop, we make it very clear that all of these controls have failed. They have just outright failed, and we are pressure testing things. Because as much as we try to have defense in depth, and we have, let's say, multiple moats and multiple barriers, if you wanted to use that analogy, what we're going to assume is that one of those ended up failing. So what do we do about it? Because we can't go under the assumption that X is going to always solve the problem.
Michael is also submitting comments around how critical it is to be superbly careful with board's actual time, and make sure that whatever you're doing is prepared so well that the board is immersed in this exercise. This is a huge investment of their energy. So the way the exercise has to be constructed has to be immersive and engaging and interesting and exciting. And that, I think, is a secret sauce. How do you prepare for the exercise that will be punchy, high value in the shortest amount of time? Because the time of board members, of course, is quite valuable,
Oh,
right?
100%. And I presented to the Governance Professionals of Canada not too long ago, and that was something that came up. So, in terms of making the best use of time, my advice would be if there's a board retreat, if there's something on the agenda yearly for an education session, what better way to pull that together and to make sure that things are sequenced so that if there are specific board packages that are leading up to that event, it's a great way of being able to do micro learning, if you will, that ultimately culminates in that board level tabletop that you
100%.
want to pressure test. Yeah.
And what we know about technology executives, not just CISOs, but all technology executives, the call of the moment is for them to show up as business leaders first, to actually engage their business peers on their terms. This could be such a powerful additional thing that they can bring into the conversation that will continue to actually elevate and further demonstrate the value of this technology leader showing up as the business executive peer, right? Perhaps as part, as you said, as part of the overall, tech savvy educational program that I have, raising everybody's bars up, right? This would be a wonderful element to that, of course. Brennan, thank you. This was fantastic. So now people know whom to call if they have questions and interest in organizing board level tabletop gaming on cyber. So Brennan, can you make you have a sort of slide that shows how can people reach you?
You bet. Let me share this here. Hopefully it
Although
works.
in today's day and age, this is a rather obvious, like super simple. There we go. There we go. You got it. There's a QR code. Of course, available, of course, on LinkedIn as well. So click and message, right?
And I always like to reinforce this is a legitimate QR code from LinkedIn. So this isn't this isn't a social engineering
Yeah,
exercise.
yeah. That would be,
Yeah.
wouldn't that be
Yeah.
fun, right? To make this really the
Yeah.
whole session, right, was really a
Yeah.
phishing attack. Um,
Yeah.
It wasn't. It wasn't, ladies and gentlemen. I was kidding. Thank you very much, Brennan. This was fantastic. Very soon, in the next few hours, we'll make it available on YouTube. And I would just like to remind those who are still listening, tomorrow I'm going to have a fantastic session. I'm welcoming James O'Dowd, who is the founder of Patrick Morgan, which is a top talent agency out of New York, looking for senior partner resources for management consulting industry globally. And we are going to discuss the transformation that professional services industry, and most specifically management consulting, is going through today. So if you're interested in the topic of management consulting, you should not be missing the session tomorrow, which is happening at the same time, noon Eastern. So with that, thank you very much, Brandon. It was an absolute pleasure, and thank you all for listening. See you next time.
So much.
Bye.